Guns in fantasy. A topic that's always interested me from a conceptual standpoint. How does technology intermingle with fantasy settings? What happens to a society where magic reigns once technology like firearms are created in that world specifically? And how does it change that world? The question that fundamentally comes to mind is, can guns exist in a fantasy setting? In truth, the short answer is, of course they can. Fantasy at the end of the day is whatever you make of it, or else it wouldn't really be fantasy. It doesn't have any stringent rules for what defines it, and fantasy as a concept is ever evolving, and we as creators, dreamers, and writers evolve alongside it. However, I've found the concept of guns, or rather, the representation of them in fantasy settings, to be a rather contentious topic. In our video today, I'll be going over just this, since I'm here to more or less explore the concepts of why firearms are kind of almost inevitable in most worlds, and why they're needed, their effects on the society that they're brought into, and what technological advancement symbolizes to a fantasy world. So, guns in fantasy. It's a really funny term because when I say guns, I really mean the thing most people think of when they imagine the technology that becomes normalized with the comeuppance of firearms in a given world. Since firearms are kind of a red herring for all the various technologies that come along to it in the fantasy setting. Like telegraphs, light bulbs, typewriters, electric steel cars, and trains. A lot of these inventions would allow for fast travel and communication for just the simple common folk, and these inventions would inherently revolutionize the trajectory of a fantasy world's development. Through trade, commerce, and the ease of communication, the average standard of living rises exponentially for the common person, just as it did in our real life. However, there are some people who believe that an element like firearms and the technologies that it can bring sometimes can take away from the fantastical elements of the fantasy world that they've created. However, it doesn't. There is something called dungeon punk, or in other terms, spellpunk. Think of the Eberron setting for D&D, or the Legend of Korra, or even the world of Arcane. And for those unfamiliar with the term, spellpunk refers to a state of fantasy where magic has become much more proceduralized. You know, when your magic looks less like a soft magic system where it's boundless in its scope and more like a hard one, where it's bound by many overlapping rules and looks more like a science than actual magic itself. However, a component of spellpunk is medieval stasis, which essentially means a world stuck within something that looks like the medieval era for one reason or another. In these settings, characters in magic armor fight with swords and shields on the tops of magically propelled trains and airships. As they fight off and fend a man with a firearm from the far distance, their enchanted armor scatters the bullets as it hits them. Firearms in a world like this would probably be about as commonplace as magic in their use. However, you could argue that this isn't really the fantasy you know and love. Yet, it is. Elves will still live for hundreds of years. The Feywild will still be out of control as beings slip into our world and begin to trick our minds. Dragons will still wipe out entire towns in a single night because they had a bad night's rest. It's just now they have a much harder time doing so with 24 rifles pointed at them. One place that I've seen this handled exceptionally well is with the creator of Critical Role's Exandria, Matt Mercer, and specifically how it's depicted in the Legend of Vox Machina. Big spoilers ahead for those of you who are not currently caught up with the series, and by the way, if you haven't watched this series and you enjoy fantasy media at all, you should 100% give it a watch. It has 3 seasons and not one of them has disappointed me. I might be a little biased because they're ultimately the reason I started my professional DMing career 6 years ago. And speaking of DMing careers, hey guys, I'm Zach. And if you're coming across me for the first time, I'm a professional storyteller with over 10,000 hours of experience under my belt. And here on YouTube, I create videos about my world building projects, little video essays like this one you're watching right now about my views on fantasy literature, and I also create systems for D&D and talk about how they can enhance your gameplay and make it a lot more fun. You know, putting an end to the turn-by-turn monotony of combat and giving your choices a greater purpose by designing systems that actively support them. I've created many systems from my Elden Ring Ashes of War inspired battle art system, which sets out to give every single martial class its own unique flavor, as well as different features for you to use in between your combat rounds. You know, instead of just waiting 10 minutes for your turn to eventually come by just so you can say the same thing you said the last 3 turns, I attack twice. To my Jujutsu Kaisen inspired spellbinding system, which allows for the customization of already existing spells to such a degree that a player fundamentally makes their own magic. I even recently included a rule, an absolute, that after spellbinding you must rename the spell that you have customized. After all, you're changing it so much it might as well be yours, and that's a good thing. And if you're looking to be a part of some of the best D&D you'll ever experience on the internet, you can go and head over and join my Discord and apply for a game. Or, if you find one of my listings over in Roll20, you can apply there instead. With introductions out of the way, it's time to leap back into part 1 of our video. What you really mean when you say, I don't like guns in fantasy. We start with Exandria, the world of the Legend of Vox Machina. It's an interesting world. You have explosive magic, holes and rifts to elemental planes, cross-planar travel, dragon fights, getting high in the Feywild, and a guy with a gun. But it doesn't even ever seem out of place. Not once. In fact, it fits right in, and over the course of the series, through flashbacks, we begin to understand just how these weapons came about. Through guided abject curiosity of one incredibly smart individual who understands the threat of what he's created in this world, Percival. He understands this so much so that throughout the series of the official campaign, Percy goes out of his way to keep firearms out of the hands of people who should not have them, sometimes by shooting them off. He views it as an evil he released into the world through his own naivete, and greatly regrets having introduced his world to a near unprecedented level of violence through these firearms. In the most recent season, Dr. Anna Ripley hatches a grand plan, which is to essentially give everyone, and I mean everyone, a fighting chance against the magic hierarchies of her world. Which, you know, this isn't inherently a bad thing, as we see Ripley's past with having her entire life destroyed by a single group of mages who just simply coveted the materials that her village mined. Her inherent desire is to even the playing field between those with magic and those without it, leading to the mass production of guns in the search for a very violent form of equality that she wishes to achieve. This is a point I'll touch on later in this video, but for now let's move on to another example of why a creator doesn't want guns in their world, but also a look as to why that is. You see, I think that guns often spell the death of the metaphorically fantastical, because when you think of guns, you think of the technology that comes behind them, and when you think of the technology, you think of industrialization. You think dark smoke-filled skies and massive factories that eject enormous amounts of green gases into the atmosphere. You think of the death of anything natural within a mile radius. In some of your minds, industrialization to a certain degree spells the end of wonder, and that is honestly kind of true, as industrialization often represents the ending of the natural and the start of urban sprawls and massive unnatural concrete cities. Then there's the darker aspect of it. A gun has one purpose: to game end the other person on the other side of it. And if it were meant to help people, then it would mend their wounds and not make them. Objectively speaking, this is where magic can capture us. It can be used for both. Magic can create wonders, but magic can also be used for even worse atrocities than even technology, since the limit of magic is realistically determined by the limits of our collective imaginations as creatives. And it's vast and extremely scary at times. I mean, just think about it. You're in a wizard duel and the guy on the other side polymorphs you into a rabbit. Your little rabbit brain is freaking out and can only sense danger, so you run. Then, in an unintelligible booming voice, he casts a grand spell, Power Word Game End. Your little rabbit heart explodes in your chest as you turn back into a human. You look up at the sky, your vision slowly fading to darkness. The mage walks over you and raises you back as a zombie. Bro, what the Who wrote this? Oh, I did. So continuing on with our discussion, we understand the effects of industrialization and how it affects society because we've had our front row seat to it for the past 200 years. But for part 2 of our video, I want to look more critically at how magic truly affects society and how it might shape it. In short, many fantasy worlds would realistically fall into magicracy at one point or another, as those who have and can control magic would realistically use it to stand at the top of their world. People with magic, through either fear or abject power, would use these advantages to gain in their society in whatever means necessary, in whatever way they can. Wizardry and the like would probably be mostly used by the rich folk, or at the very least by people with the means to easily produce money for material costs of magic. Magic in D&D, for instance, has a lot of high-cost components, and eventually a less fortunate wizard would be gated from the arcane advancement that they rightfully deserve, because he simply lacks the funds to continue his studies, so he tries to look for other potential alternatives, whereas the noble wizard would have no issue achieving greater heights due to the wealth of their family and their background. Perhaps the less fortunate wizard turns to banned means of trying to overcome this gap, like the use of blood magic to supplement for arcane materials, a practice shunned by the magic community for its perceived barbarism. Or perhaps they start utilizing the various naturally found ores and materials as a stand-in for what they need. You see, you probably haven't noticed the issue, right? I'm still talking about mages. They would be at the center of any high fantasy world simply because they hold the most power and would probably influence through said power the entire world. In my own fantasy setting of Aeseris, there's a location on the central continent of Aesteth, referred to as the Sovereign of Pilmore, and its capital city, Lyridol. This places this concept at the forefront of everything. What would happen if we allowed magic to find its natural place in society? And it of course became a magicracy that is ruled over by 4 archmages who hold power over various political and internal dealings, called Spire Lords. The city of Lyridol itself is split into various wards, but the one we're going to focus on here is the Vermilius ward, where all the non-magic users live. However, it's where innovation thrives, it's where non-magical forms of medicine are taught and learned, and it's also where guns originated from in my fantasy setting. Under the pressures of the magicratic society, it was forged. The desire for a great equalizer was born there. A tool that allows a person who lacks magical talent to stand up to one with it, albeit with violence. I believe under the weight of such societies where one group is marginally treated worse for one reason or another, there is sure to be uprisings and the desire to tear and reconstruct the whole system. This only increases over time. This is what the gun in fantasy represents in my eyes, a burning desire to have a chance as a mundane, everyday person in a fantastical, magical world surrounded by what the impossible would look like. However, the impacts of magic on people isn't the only thing to consider. We have to look at how this technology impacts the magic-based society is introduced to. And with that, we now enter the third part of our video. Guns versus magic. In the series of Shadow and Bone, this anecdote is answered quite poignantly. It's a central focus of the narrative that mages of that world referred to as Grisha are slowly losing their influence as technology and warfare develops, lessening their potency in combat and warfare. There was a conversation about the effectiveness of a Grisha soldier and how advancement in weaponry affected their standing rather greatly in conflicts, and as such their lives were valued considerably less as time passed on, as technology advanced. This is actually mentioned very quickly in the second episode of the series, telling you immediately the impacts of technology on the more mystical forces of its world. The general in the show stated that when he first started, it was 1 mage for every 50 men. Then the revolver pistol was invented, and then Grisha were only worth 24 men. Then when he lost to an enemy force's repeating rifle, 1 in 10 Grisha accounted for every death on the battlefield, and then and only then was it said that it was an acceptable ratio for them. And then a Grisha's life is still worth the lives of 10 other people, which is insane. But with technology making all of these advancements, one of the greatest perils of the world is still magical. It's called the Shadowfold, and it effectively chopped an entire country in half. That is to say, it placed a dark tear on a vast stretch of land where there is no light inside of it. The winged monsters you find will basically rip you to pieces if you try to cross it. There is no technology that can handle this phenomenon, and attempts are at times not even remotely successful, leading to the deaths of everyone. The only way they counter it in the show is with a little risk, and that is simply to fly over it. Ideally, technology never usurps magic, but it's a tool used to mitigate it, but not necessarily overtake it. What I mean when I say that is, when technology is introduced to a fantasy setting, it should never be more quote-unquote powerful than the magic of that world. Within this context, magic should be a tool all on its own with a very distinct purpose, divorced from technology entirely. But you must include what makes magic, well, magic, and that it is a force of nature never truly understood. I find that element of magic to be why it's so alluring in the first place. A saying I just thought of comes to mind when I think of it. We understand how to jump to the moon, but we're very far off from dancing amongst the stars. In my mind, that's what magic is. It's so vast and unknown. By its very nature, it's why we're drawn to it. But the more we learn about it, the less we truly know. It's why I've made the magic systems of my world so easy to understand at a basic level, and that can make them come off as basic at first, but this is by design. As you begin to gain more power within my narrative settings, magic becomes much more abstract the higher level you go, and something you feel its complexity far outweighs anything you could ever hope to understand. You see, my ideal magic within a world can be understood at a very basic level, like how we understand how to do addition, subtraction, and division. And going back to my earlier saying, you could know how to shoot a rocket to the moon, but you'll never really know what's at the center of a black hole. You may have theories, but you'll never gain any explicit proof, at least not right now. And that's the fun in maintaining the mystery of magic. And due to the nature of magic, its potential should be ideally limitless. After all, that unlimited potential is what draws us to magic in most stories we read, write, and watch in the first place. However, technology is completely understood. Its ins and outs, its potential. We as its creators fully understand our creations, and that gives us a type of certainty that magic never could. And before we hop into some of the last sections of our video, I'll just quickly recap what we've discussed so far. In part 1, we looked at why a creator may want firearms within their world, then how at a baseline, magic within a world may devolve into magiocracy, where the mages have all the power, and in part 3 we spoke on how technology can impact a world that has magic in it. As we move on to part 4 of our video, technology is freedom for the oppressed. For the downtrodden in society, it is their way to fight against a potentially unjust system, and especially if they're without arcane power in this inherently magical world. For this, I'll bring up 2 examples. First being Anna Ripley from the Legend of Vox Machina as a direct one-to-one of what I mean, and Jinx from Arcane as a more indirect example of those very same ideas. We now make a return to the discussion about Anna Ripley from the Legends of Vox Machina. We look at the newest release season where we find out Ripley's entire motivation for wanting to develop firearms en masse. As mentioned, she has a contentious history, getting a front row seat to the pure unfiltered destruction of just what a few mages can do. When she seeks to place firearms in the hands of all non-mages, it is specifically so that the status quo is ruined. The power balance of the world is tossed in disarray, as the level of violence non-magic users are capable of now, in her mind, can rival what mages are capable of at a very basic level. Which is why she sees no issue with their deadly nature. To her, magic is simply a gun, a function for violence, and no difference than the cold steel of a barrel. It is ultimately a tool of rebellion against a world which has done nothing but take from her. one she sees as inherently flawed, since she herself is also moved along by fate, by the throes of magic, even against her will. From the mages which killed her parents and destroyed her village, to the Briarwoods where we have Silas, a mythological vampire, a product of his wife who is an adept arcane mage herself, and finally, down to Orthax, a smoke demon. We see throughout her life from the start it was controlled by magic and those who have it. Even when she's killed, her last breath is taken from her by an arrow pulled from the strings of a vestige, a magical weapon blessed by the gods of her world. Even in death, she can't escape the suffocating presence of magic and all that it has taken from her. As we look to Arcane and more or less Zon, we can see that their use of technology in this world is a way to grant themselves identity and freedom. This is best represented in Jinx, more so than anyone else throughout Arcane. We only see the use of firearms from Piltover. However, we see Jinx breaks this rule, as the only Zonite that I saw within the series, or one of the only Zonites at least, that uses firearms actively, despite them being somewhat unavailable to the native Zonite. But she does this from a point of rebellion. Her inventions, as cruel as they may be, sometimes are a symbol of this stand against the status quo of her world. She was able to do all of this with a box of scraps in a cave. This is made even more apparent by the fact that most fights in Zon are between Zonites, and these are full-out brawls. These aren't shootouts with bullets flying everywhere. It's mostly person to person, punch to punch. However, Jinx is the only one from this region to wield any type of real firepower. She is also the only force within Zon that represents freedom. Not the many chem barons we see throughout the show. No, it is only her, which represents the freedom of her people. And her most iconic scene from Season 1 is exactly that. An act of defiance against an oppressive force that we've seen take everything away from her. But wrapping that subject up, we head into the final part of our journey in this video, with Part 5, Harmony. You see, a lot of the times I find that people think of technology and magic as entirely separate beasts, instead of considering to think about the technology within their world as a part of its potential wonders. I really enjoy this idea of a world and its magic developing simultaneously, as it should. I believe that you can easily achieve the big guy with the sword aesthetic, with the guy in glasses holding rifle aesthetic, and still maintain the spirit of fantasy without entirely losing it. When I think about tech growing in fantasy, I think about all the beauty it can bring, the ugly, and just about everything in between. I look at the fact that when you integrate the fantastical with the mechanical, you always end with a new original idea, because everyone's relationship, yours and mine's, with technology is different, and everyone is bound to have a new and different take as to how magic affects the inventive parts of their world and culminates together. It is in this limitless string of possibilities that I find myself with my creativity sparked. As we open this Pandora's box of imagination, and I stand here ever inspired by the ideas which come from it. And that, my friends, is why I love guns in fantasy. This is Zag the Mythweaver, and thanks for watching. With us reaching the end of this video, I highly appreciate all of you for sticking around until the end. If you liked the video and wish to see more content like this from me, go ahead and leave a like. And if you want to come along for hopefully more of these deep dives into my favorite aspects of fantasy, go ahead and subscribe while you're at it. And for those who stay to the end, I currently have a preview test version of my limit break system for D&D. So be sure to head over to my Patreon and check it out. But with that, my friends, we'll be seeing you in the next one.